As long as humans could look up at the sky, we've dreamed of what was up there. We worshipped it, studied it, and eventually came to understand it. And yet, the discovery of space and how it relates to us just raised more questions. What did it mean that the universe was not just us? That the Earth was but a tiny fraction? That the sky was more than simple weather patterns, but complex galaxies, stars, atmospheres, and planets aligning in perfect harmony? Were we alone? What would it mean to travel through it? We approach the 20th century with little in terms of answers, but plenty in terms of questions. So to answer them, we started telling stories. From the early works of Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and Hugo Gernsback that provided the basis to a lot of early science fiction narratives, to fantastical silent space films like Georges Méliès's A Trip to the Moon, we got our earliest foundations of the sci-fi genre. But that was just the beginning. Finally, around the 50s and 60s, the genre had solidified. This is around when the film world got Forbidden Planet and hit adaptations of H.G. Wells' works, while the sci-fi genre in literature boomed. Alongside Ray Bradbury, Frank Herbert, and Larry Niven came the so-called Big Three of sci-fi literature: Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, and Isaac Asimov. From these writers and the booming successes of space serials like Flash Gordon and a certain TV show by the name of Star Trek, sci-fi took over. From there, you can draw a direct line to our modern conceptions of sci-fi. The success of Star Trek prompted film studios to start pushing sci-fi more and more at the box office, and from that, and inspired by the serials, came Star Wars, ushering in a new age of swashbuckling space adventures. The investigations of Clarke and Star Trek led to films about what alien life could possibly be like, and the unknown enigmas of space. Stories of domineering space crews who conquered the wild west of space resembled Heinlein's Competent Men. And Bradbury and Asimov's work in dystopia helped inspire the modern cyberpunk genre as we know it. I feel like if you were to ask most audiences what they think the most popular kind of sci-fi is, it'd be one of those. Most likely the Star Wars adventure stories. Regardless, all of these genres focus on what is alien first and foremost, our separation from space, and the fear and excitement that comes with it. But if you were to ask me, the most interesting stories of all are how space can reveal ourselves. There's something about space itself that brings out a certain self-awareness. I mean, we used to think we were the center of the universe. Now we know how much everything dwarfs us. The infinite black void that contains so much to explore that we can only touch a fraction of makes us realize just how small we are. How insulated. As Carl Sagan once commented, in the expanse of the universe, Earth is but a pale blue dot. And in that scale, what is a human then? I think that is the crux of a lot of what I've dubbed slow space films. Yes, I know, I'm very creative with names. These are films like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Solaris, Moon, World on a Wire, Sunshine, Ad Astra, and so on, that use the endless void of space as a ground for analysis of not only the self, but of humanity on a larger scale. using the otherworldly cosmos to separate us from ourselves. Some may be about how important our relationships to each other can be. Some can be about how we may not understand the control others have on our lives. And in the case of my second favorite film of all time, 2001: A Space Odyssey, they may be an intense interrogation on how humanity's knowledge has been used to execute cruelty in the follies of such a carefree attitude towards it. I think within the vast unknown reaches of the endless vacuum of space, we find ourselves realizing how truly insignificant we are. And how can we understand the vast expanse of that if we don't understand ourselves? I think that personal element is why these films exist. We can explore space all we want, but at the end of the day, we're still human. So then, how can we use space itself to analyze the human? And that is where a film like High Life comes in. High Life is the latest film from French auteur and one of my personal favorite filmmakers, Claire Denis. For decades, she has been one of the most impressive directors in all of cinema, despite being relatively unknown compared to some in her field. It's a career full of high marks, from the brilliant TV movie US Go Home, which explores the follies of growing up set against the backdrop of US occupation, Trouble Every Day, a gory film using vampirism, violence, and sex to tell a sickening story of control, and the masterpiece that is Bolshevik, a discussion of toxic masculinity, cruelty, and gay love told against the backdrop of a cruel, cruel war. But High Life was unique. For one, it was her first out-and-out full sci-fi feature. She had dabbled in it with some short films prior, but never in a full feature. It would also be her first ever film entirely in English. It was also how I discovered her in the first place, because I read stories building a hype around the film due to its bizarre production history, and wanted to know more about her. See, apparently the idea had been in the works for 15 years prior to production. It originally started with Vincent Gallo in mind, as she joked he acted like the last man in the universe. From there, in the planning, the main performer envisioned was the late Philip Seymour Hoffman, but his passing put the project to bed for a bit. That is, until Robert found out about it. Robert Pattinson was, and of course still is, a huge fan of Denis' work, and absolutely wanted nothing more than to work with her, particularly on such an ambitious project. There's basically stories of him trying to get into any meeting he could surrounding the film until the casting director finally got him and Denis to meet face to face. And while at the time she had her doubts, she admits he was pretty solid in the role now. So now, after over a decade, the film could finally be made. So what's it like? Well, it's kind of a difficult question, but I'll try my best. The film is told in a non-linear fashion, starting off with Monty, played by Robert Pattinson, alone in a spaceship with a child he takes care of. With resources lowering, we get a clue to the mystery as to what's going on, as Monty disposes of the dead bodies of his crew members to help limit the resources being used. And in that, we flash back to the beginning. It turns out Monty is a member of a group of prisoners currently serving life sentences that have been recruited to go on a mission into space to, quote, make something of their lives by extracting energy from a black hole. Monty is serving a life sentence for the murder of another child when he was a little boy. The other child had killed his dog, his one and only companion.
Break the laws of nature. You'll pay for it. You little son of a bitch. You little son of a bitch.
So since we've gotten to talking about it, I think it's about time to talk about admittedly, unpacking the entire US prison complex is, well, pun not intended, a bit complex. Common knowledge would be that the goal of a prison when it was first proposed to the public was as a facility for housing criminals and rehabilitating them for the sake of society. At least, that was the original idea. Nowadays, I don't think anyone would consider it that at all. It has since become more focused on the idea of punishment of seemingly dangerous individuals as its goal. How do these punishments surface? Well, let's get more into the film itself. Among the crew is bizarre doctor and scientist Dr. Dibbs, played by Juliette Binoche. Dibbs is a doctor who has been sentenced for killing her own children and husband before attempting suicide herself, and as such can only conduct science through her journey on the ship. As such, she uses the crew as guinea pigs in an experiment to see if she can create a baby via artificial insemination in space, surrounded by all the radioactive materials on the ship, but she has yet to succeed. This is where we're introduced to what the cast has lovingly nicknamed the fuck box. So just because my mother watches my videos, I'd like to extend a message to her that I'm very sorry for all that I'm about to talk about. The fuck box, or the box as it's referred to in the film, is a bizarre machine used to retrieve sexual specimen from the crew. And while to some of you that may sound like something fun and a nice time, the framing puts it in a different light. The crew seem relatively terrified of the box itself. Journey, played by Andre 3000, actively states that directly.
Masturbating, you can do that to death. This fuck box, Jesus, that's a whole nother rabbit hole.
And it's not portrayed in a positive light. In a way, it kind of resembles something sexual, and yet you couldn't really describe it as something of this earth. It is fittingly alien. And the track played during the most intimate experience we get with the fuck box is a pulsating industrial dirge, which draws attention to the fact that the experience doesn't seem fully enjoyable to any of the crew. Like, Dr. Dibbs seems to be at least somewhat having a typically enjoyable sexual experience, but there's also a look of pain, terror, cosmic horror. Like, she doesn't know what she's gotten herself into, but knows it's impossible to question. As a result of these strange, terrifying experiences, Monty actively refuses to participate, and actually goes a step forward and refuses to indulge in any sexual interactions at all, becoming completely celibate. Oh no, does that make Monty a volcel? To any viewers who are curious what a volcel is, you shouldn't be. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. Don't look it up. But at the end of the day, Dr. Dibbs does allow Monty to abstain despite her disappointment. At least for now. Though in that moment, it does seem strange to think about. Why are they all mostly focused on this experiment? It really has nothing to do with why they were set up there. It's just a mild side mission to do in addition to what they're mainly up there for. And yet, they all feel like they can't help but submit, even though it's weighing heavily on their minds. Only Monty refuses and the rest seem to be scared too. Which brings us to a simple idea. What does the sexual experiment represent here? I like to point out a very simple thing we often forget when discussing this film. These are prisoners. They have been basically required to be sent up to space, and they will most likely die for what they've done. If they even have a chance of coming back, everyone they know will long be dead, due to the fact that they're traveling at near speed of light. Now, their stated goal is to travel to the black hole and extract its energy. But you might notice a lot of the film deals with just the sexual experiment. In fact, it honestly dominates the crew's brain much more than any of their tasks for the mission do. See, as stated before, the experiment is only a secondary goal that is much less important than the black hole. But it mentally serves a purpose of controlling them. It is in this essence that the sexual experiment, a thing that has nothing to do with the stated goal of what they're supposed to be doing, but is more meant as a control system, starts to resemble prison labor. Just like the experiment, punishment through prison labor does not really have anything to do with the concept of rehabilitation. It's meant to be grueling and painful and be a punishment. Much of it is with little gain for the self as well, as all the work done will never result in much of any joy for the workers, as they receive little to no pay and never get to see the fruits of their labor. I'd like to point out to anyone in the audience who is going to inevitably comment, "Why would they need money in jail?" that the simple fact that serving time often means losing your job means that many of them come out of jail with no money and are essentially homeless. So, getting some money in jail is kind of important if we're trying to rehabilitate people. It's also without recognizing the fact that many prisons require prisoners to pay for certain things in jail, including necessary items like medical supplies and even feminine products. Separating them from their choice in work and the fruits of it does, in fact, have an intense negative material effect. But I'd argue there's also a serious mental effect, too. See, I view separating the worker from any products of their work, but still requiring that work, as a form of mental anguish. In that sense, you are constantly reminded of your powerlessness in the system. You often do not get a choice in when or where or what you work in. You have little access to any results of your labor. You are simply toiling away for someone else's benefit. And you have to live with that, with no choice. To quote Michel Foucault in his seminal work Discipline and Punish,
it might be objected that imprisonment, confinement, forced labour, penal servitude, prohibition from entering certain areas, deportation, which have occupied so important a place in modern penal systems, are physical penalties. Unlike fines, for example, they directly affect the body. But the punishment-body relation is not the same as it was in the torture during public executions. The body now serves as an instrument or intermediary. If one intervenes upon it to imprison it or to make it work, it is in order to deprive the individual of a liberty that is regarded both as a right and as property. The body, according to this penalty, is caught up in a system of constraints and privations, obligations and prohibitions. Physical pain, pain of the body itself, is no longer the constituent element of the penalty.
See, one of the cruelest aspects of forced labor that cannot be seen by the public eye is a very simple fact of life. We like to keep ourselves busy. For example, see how during the pandemic, even if you weren't at work, you often found projects for yourself. And how often these projects were much more satisfying because you saw the direct benefits of your work and did it by your choice. This is often quantified as the difference between work and labor. And by taking away the choice or the ability to enjoy any of the benefits of working, up to including a paycheck, you necessarily alienate the person's actions from themselves. And that directly leads to them feeling isolated and without control. As stated in Aaron Hatton's report, When Work is Punishment,
even as labor may yield limited benefits for incarcerated and workfare workers, e.g. warding off isolation and boredom, their labor is legally, socially, and institutionally constructed as punitive. Nearly 2/3, 63%, of incarcerated workers object to their lack of autonomy in choosing whether to work and in negotiating the terms of their employment.
It should also be noted that in the last nationwide prison census from 2005, 1.5 million prisoners were working, including 600,000 in manufacturing alone. That makes up more than 4% of all manufacturing jobs, done by people with very little choice, and maybe not even getting paid some of the time. Now, if I can put on my left tube hat for a second, one could compare this to Karl Marx's concept of the alienation of the worker from the means of production, and I do think there is something worth exploring in that comparison. But for this film in particular, I'd like to focus on the prison specifically because I think there's something really interesting to say there. Because we already have a much more well-known word for when a worker is forced to work for little or no pay with no choice. We call it slavery. Now, you might be hearing that and going, well, Emily, certainly comparing prison labor to slavery is a bit far. Besides, we banned slavery. To which I say,
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. In other words, it grants freedom to all Americans. There are exceptions, including criminals.
There's a clause, a loophole.
If you have that embedded in the structure, in this constitutional language, then it's there to be used as a tool for whichever purposes one wants to use it.
I need that emphasized for all of you. The 13th Amendment includes an exception to the banning of slavery. We put an except after outlawing slavery. And in that means in the Constitution, it is codified that prison labor is slavery. And that also, it's still legal. I don't know how you all feel about that, but that sickens me, and I hope it sickens all of you too. We've known that this was slavery for over a century, and then we put it into our Constitution and codified it into law.
When I think of systems of oppression, historically in this country and elsewhere, they're durable and they tend to reinvent themselves, and they do it right under your nose.
This can also be seen in how a lot of prisons have built the labor force they often make money off of by targeting Black Americans.
So many aspects of the old Jim Crow are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. And so it seems that in America, we haven't so much ended racial caste, but simply redesigned it.
So in this, we must go back to the metaphor of high life. What does the experiment represent? Well, much like productivity, sex is kind of built into most of humanity. There are, of course, many people on the A spectrum or otherwise who may not feel a drive for sex or abstain from it. But for much of society, sex is a part of their nature. And in sex, choice and comfort are some of the most satisfying parts of it. Even the roughest forms of BDSM are always performed with a safe word and a knowledge that there is consent and there is safety if it ever becomes uncomfortable. Sex is supposed to be an act of equality and comfort, and the experiment in this film takes that away. They're required to do it at certain times and all for someone else and never for their own satisfaction. All of the control and choice in the situation has been taken away. And when that mental punishment is put upon people, things can go bad fast. I need to preface this section with a content warning. See, if you saw the content warning at the beginning of the video, I'd like to state that here is where I deal with the subjects of suicide and sexual assault. Sexual assault not only as a reality, but used as a metaphor. And right away, I can understand any hesitation to that concept. Sexual assault is a serious subject, and it can be hard to hear used as a metaphor and not imagine some sort of unfortunate or deliberate callousness. And you are very welcome to feel this way. I have always maintained this channel is not meant to replace your opinion, and your experience with art is always your own. However, I do think it's important to discuss this part of the film in terms of the allegory I outlined, and I would like to say for the record that I genuinely believe this was done in good faith. After all, Denis has talked about being a victim of sexual assault herself. So if you are uncomfortable with the way sexual assault is used in the film, I do not blame you. That is a valid reaction. But I do think it's an important part of the discussion of this film, and that if Denis as a survivor feels comfortable putting it in this film, I feel like it's worth talking about. Anyway, that's your warning. Let's continue. As the experiment goes on, we see the first baby delivered, and how it's been unsuccessful. The baby has died in childbirth, and the mother will also soon die of its effects. From here on, things start to devolve. It starts with the ship captain Chandra having a stroke due to developing leukemia from radiation poisoning. Dr. Dibbs euthanizes him and has now taken full control of the ship. Another crew member, gone. And it's here the film starts to deal with the mental torture of its characters. As stated before, forced labor can have an intense effect on the mental faculties of prisoners. As stated by the International Red Cross and World Health Organization,
there are factors in many prisons that have negative effects on mental health, including overcrowding, various forms of violence, enforced solitude or, conversely, lack of privacy, lack of meaningful activity, isolation from social networks, insecurity about future prospects, work, relationships, etc., and inadequate health services, especially mental health services in prisons. The increased risk of suicide in prisons, often related to depression, is unfortunately one common manifestation of the cumulative effects of these factors.
In addition to the effects of mental illness it invokes in members of the prison population, one might also suggest it's also an influence behind other, more immeasurable things. Is it a stretch to say that such tortuous conditions might be so taxing on prisoners that it could cause violence, that it could help create riots, fights, or prisoner-on-prisoner violence? And with that topic, as we reach this point in the film, many of the prisoners start to turn on each other. The first to do so, doing it in the most shocking of ways. Ettore has throughout the film been one of the most volatile and intimidating figures in the crew, so the fact that he's the first to break into violence is not entirely surprising. How he does that, however, is even shocking by the film standards. Ettore sneaks into Boise's room and attempts to violently sexually assault Boise in a gut-wrenchingly horrifying scene. Ettore's roommate, the ship's pilot, Nansen, attempts to intervene, but she is subdued by him, only for Monty to finally arrive and overpower Ettore and beat him senselessly to a pulp. As the scene seemingly ends and Monty brings Boise to be treated, Minx breaks out and stabs Ettore in the hallway in revenge, finally killing him. As a result, Dr. Dibbs, who is now in control, starts administering double the amount of sedatives given to the prisoners, and then sneaks into Monty's room. When in the room, Dr. Dibbs violates Monty's rule of chastity and has sex with him while he is asleep, then using that sex to get a sample and artificially inseminate Boise with it, without the knowledge or consent of Monty or Boise. I want to be clear here. While the other event may have been more violent and shocking, this is just as much rape. There was no consent here from Monty or Boise. They couldn't. They were drugged. And it should be stated that Claire was adamant about calling it rape in interviews. I'd like to add here that while these moments of sexual assault may fit into the film's metaphor on prison labor, the concept is not alien to the prison system on its own. There is a sadly large amount of sexual assault that happens in prison, many done by corrections officers or those in power to get the prisoners to do what they want. The latter scene could be seen as a more direct version of that. Sexual assault, like labor, is used in prisons as a punishment. Much less outlined legally, but it happens. And these scenes do in part represent that. From here, Boise has the baby, the first healthy baby born via artificial insemination in space, the first of the subjects of the experiment to survive, only for the baby to be taken from Boise immediately for Dr. Dibbs to run tests on it. Here is where I'd like to tell you about the character of Boise, played by Mia Goth. Boise is quite temperamental. She seems to oscillate between vindictive and violent, to sultry and seductive, to scared and uncertain. She is clearly one of the most emotionally divided characters on the ship, but in that has formed a sort of bond with Monty. While they do not have any proper relationship, and Monty's chastity would disallow that anyway, it is clear she is someone he quite values despite her being prone to violent, volatile behavior. Which brings us to the next event in the story. The ship is finally approaching the black hole, and pilot Nansen is going to take the shuttle to collect the resources necessary for their mission. But unbeknownst to the crew, Boise kills Nansen and takes her place. We don't know exactly why. Maybe it was for the glory, maybe she meant it to be a suicide for the trauma she'd gone through. Regardless, in some way, what just happened to her certainly caused her to do this in some way. The mission at least seems to be going alright, until the ship travels through a molecular cloud and alters its trajectory, making it dive straight into the black hole. By the end of this horrifying sequence, Boise is killed, She faces such extreme spaghettification that her body cannot take the pressure. It simply explodes. Boise's friend and bunkmate Mink attempts to kill Dibs by attacking her, but Monty is able to kill her before she gets the chance. However, Dr. Dibs locks herself into the ejection room without a spacesuit. Monty can only watch as she tells him the kid is his, as she ejects herself in the cold recesses of space as punishment for all she's done. The last remaining crewmate, besides Monty, Cherney, Monty's best friend on the ship, commits suicide and is buried in the garden as he wished to be. The only crew members that remain are Monty and his daughter. From here, the story is no longer about the rest of the crew. We return to the beginning where Monty is left alone with his daughter, whom he has named Willow. We see now what has happened on the ship. Cut to over a decade later. Monty is now older and more grizzled, grays and white showing in his hair, as Willow is now a teenager. The ship is at this point running out of whatever resources they have remaining, and they are struggling to make it through with just themselves. Eventually they come across another ship just like theirs going through space. Monty attempts to board it to see if there is anyone else left, only to find stray dogs who have been left alone for so long they've taken to eating each other. Willow begs for Monty to take one back to see if at least one can be saved, but Monty has become pessimistic and worries, rightfully so, that the risk itself could kill them through contamination. As the film comes to a close, they come across the very reason Monty came to space in the first place, a black hole. They are alone, unsure of what's going on, and running out of resources. With very little hope left in their current situation, Willow convinces Monty to journey through it with her. That it may kill them, it may present them a new reality, it could help them find others. But it's a chance. After over a decade alone and scared, Monty takes Willow's hand as they stare out the ship's window as a yellow light we cannot comprehend comes closer and closer until it envelops the film. So with all that context, you may be asking me what the film's ending means to me. Well, the film itself is this giant metaphor on the prison system and the cruelty of it. And in the end, the mission itself has resulted in the destruction of everyone on the ship except Monty. It is, by definition, a failure, but it cannot wipe out all life. From here comes Willow, a child born out of terrible circumstances, alone and with no knowledge of where she's heading. But she's the one detached enough from the situation to still be optimistic in the face of the cruelty that caused it all. In that sense, Willow could be seen as the new generation, or maybe just new ideas in of their own. The optimism of being able to change something that is broken and live better. In this video, we've talked a lot about the abject cruelty of the prison system and how it tortures its prisoners. And this film has isolated and sent its characters into the void of space itself to highlight that cruelty. But we've yet to address possible solutions. And that's the thing, there is no definitive answer per se. We cannot know until we take that leap, and at least consider new ideas. The prison abolitionist movement has existed since the end of slavery, and its goals are to imagine a world where we do not rely on prisons as a system. To key members like writers Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, one must look at the prison and dismantle the elements that drive it to be so cruel. One must look at them and see how they create the prison in order to create a better society without one. One that does not function to create the same cycle of punishment and violence. As stated in Angela Davis's seminal work, Are Prisons Obsolete?
What then would it mean to imagine a system in which punishment is not allowed to become the source of corporate profit? How can we imagine a society in which race and class are not primary determinants of punishment, or one in which punishment itself is no longer the central concern in the making of justice? An abolitionist approach that seeks to answer questions such as these would require us to imagine a constellation of alternative strategies and institutions, with the ultimate aim of removing the prison from the social and ideological landscapes of our society. In other words, we would not be looking for prison-like substitutes for the prison, such as house arrest safeguarded by electronic surveillance bracelets. Rather, positing decarceration as our overarching strategy, we would try to envision a continuum of alternatives to imprisonment: demilitarization of schools, revitalization of education at all levels, a health system that provides free physical and mental care to all, and a justice system based on reparation and reconciliation rather than retribution and vengeance. The creation of new institutions that lay claim to the space now occupied by the prison can eventually start to crowd out the prison so that it would inhabit increasingly smaller areas of our social and psychic landscape. To reiterate, rather than try to imagine one single alternative to the existing system of incarceration, we might envision an array of alternatives that will require radical transformations of many aspects of our society.
I understand that for some of you, the idea of prison abolition is simply never going to grab you or convince you of anything. I truly understand that. But I think we'd be fools to not consider the concepts being discussed at all. I mean, I may land more on the side of prison abolitionism, but it's worth at least considering these ideas even if you will never consider that as the end goal. Ideas like how our approach to the prison system and society need to be taken in mind with how the oppression that currently exists in our society has been created. So what do Willow and Monty find? We don't know. Will we ever agree on a humane solution to the prison system? We don't know. But both offer a simple idea that is worth considering. We have to start fresh. We have to avoid accepting the reality of things as all they can be when we could move beyond that to find solutions. And this is hard. I get that. But as a society, we are still perpetuating a violent, cruel system of slavery. And I don't think it's that controversial to say we need to end that. Whatever solution takes us there, it needs to happen. But we have to question the systems that brought us here, out into the cold, unfeeling place we are now. And maybe then we can imagine a world we once thought impossible. Go beyond it. Go beyond the infinite. I'd like to give a special thanks to my $10 a month patrons: Jonathan Palacio, Silas Ray, Cameron Kanaki, Paige, Corey Fuimaona, Felicity, Arif Hassan, Aerith, Maxibon, Emily Pincus, and Trent Maudier.